Welcome to the Tyson Summer Seminar Series, week 3. We're delighted to have everyone here, all in person, and those of you who are joining online. My name is Erin O'Connell, and I'm helping coordinate research and conservation projects here at Tyson. Before we dive into our exciting seminar today, I want to take a moment for our Tyson community to recognize the upcoming holiday this weekend. So, Erin, if you could show us our next slide.
I was frozen because of the...
Okay. It'll be here in a moment. But as you know, this Sunday is Juneteenth, and Monday is a national holiday to celebrate. So as we all know, this is a celebration of the end of slavery in the United States. And we'd like to encourage you all to celebrate as best you can this weekend. And this QR code here is a link to lots of events that are happening in the St. Louis area over the next few days. So check that out and be part of that celebration. Just a reminder to those who are joining online, if you have questions, comments, etc., you can put those in the YouTube chat and we will incorporate that into our Q&A at the end. So we are very excited to host Dr. Erynn Maynard-Bean, who will talk about her research on invasive shrubs and deciduous forests. So, spoiler alert, I bet we're going to hear about honeysuckle, one of our familiar friends around here. She currently works for the Greenhouse Gas Verification Program at SCS Global Services. So this is a really neat position that bridges her personal research and applied science. She's a verification forester, which means that she's a third-party vendor who quantifies the amount of carbon that companies say that they are. Maybe you can fill in, Erin, as I'm getting this wrong, but quantify carbon and help basically audit companies that are trying to reduce their carbon footprint. So to get to this place in her life, a little bit about her journey. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science and Biology at the University of Buffalo, and then her Master's at the University of Mississippi at Oxford, and her PhD and her postdoc both at Penn State. So as you see here, she will be talking about invasive species. She studies lots of different land management topics, including fire, restoration, invasion, and forest ecology, and is particularly focused on applied sciences and land management. I first heard of her when I was studying invasive species and discovered that she was coordinating a community science project, asking people to keep track of invasive phenology, so the timing of leaf out and leaf fall in the fall. So she also dabbles in citizen science, community science, which many of you all are involved in. We have our Urban Wildlife Project here, Pontago Project, iNaturalist, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another topic you might ask her about. And this is particularly exciting to the Tyson community because Erin is one of our own. She worked here. Woo! Shout out! Yeah. She worked as a technician with Tiffany McKnight on the Plant Invaders team, which was an NSF project looking at non-native and native plants and exploring some of the ways that those impact ecosystems, especially in the prairie and the restored glades here at Tyson. So I've heard nothing but good things about Erin from all the staff at Tyson, and I'd like you all to help me welcome her home to Tyson today.
Yay! Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the introduction, Erin. And thank you all for attending. And I guess I will start off. Well, there's my name, and the people that helped with this research at Penn State are Drs. Margot Kay and Eric Burkhart. They're my co-advisors for my dissertation research, and they're great people also. And to start off, this isn't a malfunction. This is a black screen. So I would like everyone to picture where you live from the outside, looking at your house. what is the closest plant to your front door? Odds are it's probably a landscaping shrub. So for example, for this house, we have a burning bush, and it's planted right next to the front door, and it's widely planted for its beautiful fall color that is shown here, but better shown in this picture. And maybe the closest plant is a privet that's widely planted for its ability to grow fast and provide privacy hedges for people. But maybe the closest thing is a long grass or dandelion in your yard or the crack of your sidewalk. And it might not come as a surprise to many of you, but none of the species that I've just mentioned are native to this continent. They all evolved elsewhere and were introduced by people to this range in the world. And some of these non-native species are able to spread across the landscape and without the additional assistance of humans, and occur in high abundances and negatively impact native species. And the subset of non-natives that are successful and harmful to native species are frequently referred to as invasive species. And invasive plants are generally disturbance adapted early successional species that can take advantage of open resources really quickly. So they're using resources like light, space, and nutrients. And some invasive species, however, like these landscaping shrubs that I just introduced you to on the last slide, are able to infiltrate relatively intact deciduous forest understories, not these early successional disturbed habitats or habitats that aren't as easily disturbed and don't have as much open resources. And these two species of shrubs are not alone. North America is actually the recipient of more invasive shrub species than any other geographical region of the world. So eastern deciduous forests, invasive shrubs are growing in both richness and abundance. So there's lots of different species. There's a couple of the honeysuckles. I know there's a lot of Macchii at Tyson. Yeah. So today I want to hopefully shed some light on invasive shrubs in eastern deciduous forests. As an outline of what I want to talk about, why we might care about invasive shrubs. Do invasive shrubs have extended leaf phenology across the range? What are some impacts of novel leaf phenology? Are invasive shrubs special? And then conclusions and future directions. Why do we care about invasive shrubs? So it's a good place to start. Here's the privet again, and you can see it's mostly privet. There's some honeysuckle in this stand too. It's generally invasive shrubs form a much more dense canopy than we saw historically in the understory of eastern deciduous forests or just directly pre-invasion. And to begin to understand the potential impacts of this dramatic change to the understory, having this really dense invasive shrubs, researchers have measured invaded and uninvaded parts of a forest or across a gradient of invasion. So these studies cited at the bottom here have found that with more invasives, there are reduced native species diversity or abundance or reduced tree regeneration. But ecological theory predicts that where there is higher diversity or abundance of native species, right here, where there's the lowest amount of invasives, there could be something called biotic resistance, so this relationship here at this end, do we have less invasives because there's so many natives? Are natives actually resisting the invasion of other species, or are invasives pushing out natives? And that's why we see this relationship. We don't know what the causality is. And you don't know that from observational studies. So what you can do is remove invasives and then see what the response of the native community is. And people that have generally done this have looked at more modal organisms that move around, like pollinators, bees, butterflies, and reptiles and amphibians, and found that they do increase in abundance and diversity after the removal of invasives. And then people have planted in native species and seen how they survive and grow in the absence of invasives, but very few studies have had the time to wait and see like what native plants rebound after invasive shrubs are removed. But I was fortunate enough to come to Penn State for my PhD, and there had already been a removal experiment that was initiated a few years prior to my arrival, and I studied that, and it was published in Invasive Plant Science and Management. And so that removal you can see occurring here in these pictures. It was initiated in 2009. The plots are 20 meters in diameter, and that dark gray are the removal treatments. You can see here 2 of them pictured on the left, and then the light gray circles that are adjacent to each of those dark gray circles are here on the right. Those are the control plots where invasive shrubs weren't removed. And you can see that after like 8 years, there's a lot more. I mean, these where the removal has occurred, it's not like a blank slate. There's actually quite a bit of vegetation in the understory, and those are all native species. So we quantified that difference or change, and removing invasive shrubs actually increased native shrubs by about 200%. And that is both the shrubs under a meter and shrubs 1 to 4 meters in height. And we saw about 250% increase in native trees regenerating in the understory under a meter, but we did not see that difference in native trees 1 to 4 meters, which isn't entirely surprising because in deciduous forest understories, many canopy species require overstory gaps to put on significant height quickly. Otherwise, they kind of just hang out in the understory and work on their root system. So then the last strata of plants and herbs, we found that, well, so generally when you remove an invasive and cause a disturbance, there's also always the concern that you're going to promote the establishment of a new invasive plant. And we found that that wasn't the case here, even though garlic mustard was pretty present and there are quite a bit of herbaceous non-natives in the understory. There wasn't a huge amount of increase compared to the controls, at least 7 years after, when there was all this native regeneration as well. And then we did see an increase in native herb cover by about 200% again, and that's included a species of special concern in the region, which I wasn't allowed to publish in the paper, but I can tell you all was ginseng, which was super exciting to find and see developing and fruiting in the understory there, just at the treatment spots actually. So if you are wondering whether that native herb cover is just a couple species or not, I actually looked at plant diversity as well. And even though we removed 10 to 20 species of invasive shrubs by removing these, depending on the plot, there were about 10 to 20 species of invasive shrubs here, diversity still increased even with those removals of those species by about 30.6%. So in this case, it was a really good success story of being able to remove invasive species and natives being able to rebound without like a ton of effort in terms of planting that needs to go into a lot of invasive species removal projects. Yeah. So invasive shrubs are very successful at excluding native species. And of course, was left wondering why. And I thought a lot about this. That's why I did my dissertation research on it. And there are a lot of traits that make invasive plants successful. One is novel defenses, having compounds or hairs or spikes, something that they defend themselves with that herbivores in the region aren't familiar with and able to cope with. So herbivores attack natives more than the invasives. There's allelopathic chemical production, where plants exude chemistry that actually inhibits other plants and helps them maintain high population numbers, and then escape from co-evolved enemies, where a plant that moves to a new range leaves behind co-evolved pests and pathogens that would decrease their population numbers. And so some of these traits and things do apply to some invasive shrub species, but not to others. So why these species are successful as a group doesn't really seem to be answered by any of those questions. But there is one seasonally conspicuous trait that appears to unite invasive shrubs that are successful in eastern deciduous forests. And I'll show you some pictures, and hopefully it becomes obvious what I'm talking about. This is in the spring in May on the left and in April on the right. And you can see that there's a lot of sunlight reaching the forest floor. The overstory canopy is pretty bare, except for these Norway maples, which are not a non-native tree sapling in the understory, but this is mostly privet here, and it's already got green photosynthetically active leaves, whereas the natives that are adjacent to it, like this spice bush, have not even bud burst yet. And then it's already like taken advantage of that sunlight in the understory. And then in the fall, again, sun is reaching the forest floor, and this is in December. This amber honeysuckle still has green leaves. They're not as photosynthetically active as they were earlier in the season, but they still have them. And then on the right, we have barberry in the background, those little green leaves, very green and very photosynthetically active still, even this late in the season, while the native spice bush is reabsorbing its photosynthetic compounds and losing its ability to photosynthesize that late in the season. So this has been termed extended leaf phenology of the invasive shrubs, both to the overstory canopy and to other native co-occurring shrubs in the understory. And you can start to see why this might contribute to their success when you compare the light environment and what these understory species are exposed to in the spring and fall as compared to during the growing season. But before we start to think too much about the implications, the benefits and impacts associated with extended leaf phenology, has it been empirically tested or quantified? So do invasive shrubs have extended leaf phenology across their range? This work was funded by an NSF doctoral dissertation improvement grant and was published in Biological Invasions. So there are surprisingly few studies that have quantified leaf phenology of invasive shrubs. And they found, you can see, shout out to Erin O'Connell's thesis research here. It's included on the map. And there are, they show like a pretty wide range of differences depending on where in the United States and the environmental conditions and when the onset of spring happens in that region, but from 0 to 4 weeks earlier and from 2 to 6 weeks later. So I was left wondering, as people frequently are when they're working on their graduate work, of this existential crisis of like, what am I doing? Does it even matter? It's just one spot at the yellow star here on the map in central Pennsylvania where I'm looking at 3 sites. It's not going to be applicable elsewhere. So then community science came to the rescue, or citizen science came to the rescue. And I partnered with the USA National Phenology Network and the Nature's Notebook campaign, and was able to collect data over 4 years at 153 sites where people were able to identify the bud burst and leaf off of native and invasive shrubs. And they were looking, here's the logo for the National Phenology Network. It's a really awesome organization. They've got a lot of really cool free data that anyone can download and use for teaching or learning or science. And this was the range where I was asking for help, and people collect the data on at least one of these native shrubs and at least one of these invasive shrubs from somewhere in the range. And it was really great to work with the National Phenology Network. It was a really rewarding experience to have that direct interaction with the public about science and my research. And I did monthly e-newsletters and they helped me to develop a website at the National Phenology Network and do webinars and stuff to keep people motivated and identify the species properly and train people and give them summaries. So that's all to say, this all came down to using Bayesian estimation and a hierarchical modeling framework to incorporate species and their respective nativity across the continuous variable of latitude that you can see here on the x-axis. And this is leaf emergence on the left, and this is leaf off on the right. So to get, since I know I don't really think in the numbers of latitude and where they are. So to give that some meaning, the Virginia-North Carolina border, that's along that latitude, there's 38 days earlier and about 39 days later in terms of how long invasive shrubs are holding onto their leaves compared to natives. And that's a huge amount of time. And then in central Pennsylvania, where I was working, it was about 26 days earlier and about 30 days later. And then we can go all the way north to where there was non-significant differences between them in between native and invasive shrubs in northern Maine. So this research provides a context for future work anywhere in this latitudinal range, and helps you understand where research on like the benefits and impacts that invasive shrubs have on native communities, or the benefits to the invasives and the impacts to native communities, where it would be more like moving one direction or the other in latitude, where those differences would be larger or greater. So it's just like a unified framework for research moving forward, which is pretty exciting and kind of what I had in mind to do. I'm going to skip that one, and it's shows just that the research that had been done before fits within this framework. That's where these asterisks are, where data has been collected in the past, and it fits within the difference that we would expect for leaf on and leaf off for native and invasive species. All right, and also from a management perspective, if we know how much earlier invasives are going to leaf out than natives, or how much longer they're going to hold on to their leaves, that can be used as a way to detect and remove invasive species more easily on the landscape. And there are people that have even applied remote sensing data to understand what the extent of invasive species might be in some forests on a larger scale. And then this is a bonus question that wasn't in my outline, but I think it's really interesting. But why do they have extended leaf phenology? Why are invasive shrubs or shrubs not from North America? They're shrubs that are from all the species that I've talked about and are in this research so far from Western Europe or Southeast Asia. And it turns out that Zoner and Renner found, looking at the historic onset of spring, that the range where invasive shrubs come from is less variable in the onset of spring. So it is likely that historically the species of native shrubs in our forests were being exposed to more variable spring, and it made sense to be cautious in their timing of leaf on, so that they didn't get hit by a late frost. So what are some impacts of novel leaf phenology? This research was funded by the Center for Landscape Dynamics at Penn State and was published in the Natural Areas Journal. And it's about the seasonal influence that invasive shrubs have on light and temperature. I'm just going to talk about light today, though. And so there's a study that looked at the effect that Amur honeysuckle had on a native herb, and that it's really difficult when you're thinking about light, the impacts of novel leaf phenology, specifically to disentangle shading from invasive shrubs from other impacts that they might have, like below ground competition or allelopathy. So one approach that people use is to just cut off the top. And so then the shading is gone, but their root system is still there. And that's what they did in the study, and found that invasive shrubs, specifically their shade, negatively impacted pollinators, pollination, and seed set of a native herb. This is Geranium maculatum, or woodland geranium. And then another approach is to experimentally manipulate shade as if invasive shrubs were there. And when Osberger looked at extending the growing season shade, extending the shade into the spring and fall, they found that there was higher mortality in tree seedlings than if they didn't have extended shade. So tree seedlings do have an adaptation to survive in their parents' shade. So they have extended leaf phenology compared to their parents in the overstory. That's tree seedlings and saplings in the understory. And apparently it would it makes sense that it would also apply to invasive shrubs shade, increasing the mortality of tree seedlings and saplings. So in order to understand the effect that invasive shrubs have on the light environment, and to see, I test the hypothesis that invasive shrubs allow less light infiltration than natives, especially in the spring and fall. And it was at these same plots I've already talked about in Penn State's research and recreation forest. I measured photosynthetically active radiation using a septometer. And that specifically measures in the wavelength of light that plants use for photosynthesis. And then that was in the plots above invasive shrubs, above the, so 15 feet in the forest understory, and then also out in the open. And then I also looked at light energy because I wanted to see a broader part of the electromagnetic spectrum, so that it includes infrared and ultraviolet radiation, which influence like how bees and butterflies and birds see in the understory, and influence how reptiles and amphibians move in the understory, and also the heat that's transferred from light to surfaces in the understory. So it's just light energy is just more broad than photosynthetically active radiation. So I want to start off by first thinking about seasonal light availability, both in the open and in the forest understory above the shrub layer, so just below the overstory canopy trees. And if you look at, this is light data collected in the open, the amount of light is lowest in the winter, like corresponding to seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, if you've ever heard of that or experienced it. I mean, we have to have it in the climates that we live in, I guess, but so it's a lot less light is available in the winter, and it goes up in the spring and peaks in the summer. But in the understory, the peak is actually at about a third of the height of the peak in the open, and it occurs in the early spring. And that is because that's as the overstory canopy closes, less light is available, and the trees above you in the forest are what is absorbing the vast majority of the sunlight. So plants in forests are working with a lot less light than plants outside of the forest. So how do native and invasive shrubs differentially influence understory light? Well, these are seasonally bootstrapped means and confidence intervals, 95% confidence intervals across 4 years. And there's a lot of heterogeneity in forest understories, but on average, about 800 invasives reduced the amount of light in the understory by about 891 lumens per meter squared, which is roughly the equivalent of a 60-watt lamp burning in the understory. And in winter, the difference is the smallest, but there still is a significant difference. So just that more dense branching structure alone that invasive shrubs have provide a little bit of light removal. And then in the fall, that difference doubles. In the summer, it doubles again. And then in the spring, we're at like 1900 lumens per meter squared of light in the understory. So it's a lot of light energy that invasive shrubs are filtering out. Because light and light energy influence seed germination, plant growth and reproduction, ectothermic species behavior and development, and the light energy also has the potential to influence ecosystem processes like litter decomposition and nutrient cycling. And something that I studied for one of my postdocs after my dissertation was also how invasive shrubs influence fuels and fire behavior in a forest understory because of these influences on light and temperature, and then subsequently moisture in the understory. But this quantification of light and temperature allows future work to use these estimates of seasonal light the influence that invasive shrubs have on seasonal light to manipulate light in the field and in the lab to better understand how invasive shrubs specifically might influence these components of our ecosystems like seed germination and plant growth and reproduction and ectothermic species behavior, and maybe even like mosquito development and tick survival, things that I was talking with all of you about today. And then since I have time, I'm going to indulge myself in talking about whether or not invasive shrubs are special, which sounds very like maternal, everybody's special. But I mean, in terms of being an invasive, are they doing anything different well, we're going to talk about leaf traits. So there's a huge diversity of leaves produced by plants in temperate forests. And on one end of the spectrum, we have these really thin wood sorrel leaves. They're really thin and light. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have like the really thick, long-lived rhododendron. And this is just temperate forest species. An even bigger variety of leaves exists across biomes in the world. And despite this huge variety in leaves in the world, there are highly conserved trade-off relationships between leaf investments and leaf returns. And this is called, I'll show you more information so that if that didn't make sense exactly, but the Global Leaf Economic Spectrum, LES, it's a set of trade-off axes in leaf traits. So one of these trade-off axes is leaf structure. And for this, we're thinking about the investment as leaf mass area, which is the dry mass divided by the leaf area when hydrated, and a greater investment in leaf mass area, which is in leaf density or leaf thickness. So a plant invests more, it has thicker leaves, and that results in a longer leaf lifespan. So back to the previous, two species on the previous slide, that would be like this oxalis or wood sorrel, really short-lived, light, flimsy leaves on this end, and on this end we have like rhododendron with these really thick, long-lived evergreen leaves. Another trade-off axis is for photosynthesis, and this can be boiled down to leaf investment and nitrogen content, because for plants, it's one of the most so all of the machinery or equipment of photosynthesis is extremely nitrogenous. So if a plant can get more nitrogen, it can invest more nitrogen into photosynthesis and then has a higher return on that nitrogen investment in terms of photosynthetic capacity. And so you can see these relationships. These is redrawn from data that I got this data from across the world that other people had collected. You can see that these relationships are really strong. There's an R-squared value of like 0.53 for both of them, actually. But there is like scatter around that. There are plants that don't, I mean, they're all fitting this relationship, but there is some wiggle around it. So in general, though, we see this greater investment, greater return on your investment. Let's see. So if we recall that invasive plants are generally early successional, and they are able to really quickly use resources that are opened up. This is indicate, so in this old field that's, I don't know what happened there, like an old field that was recently plowed and then left fallow, it really quickly, by the end of the season, you'll see it completely taken up by these early successional species, probably many of which are non-native and adapted for fast growth. And research has shown that invasive species or weedy species tend to be higher in trait space, so they invest more and then they get a greater return on that investment. It's a fast resource use strategy, and that's why they're successful. So the first hypothesis that I wanted to test for invasive shrubs is whether they are acting like regular invasive plants and shifting up in trait space like other people have found on a global scale for invasive plants. But resources are not as available in mature forest habitat. There's lower resource availability. So if maybe there isn't an ability to shift up in trait space because those resources are just limiting in a forest understory with limited resource availability like light, space, and nutrients. And so I learned about the leaf economic spectrum from a physiological ecologist, and he was a really interesting guy, and he had ties to engineering, and he was particularly interested in novel physiological adaptations for flight in insects. And so leaf traits have these trade-off axes that I've been talking about, but also animals do for different things. And he was really interested. He's like, the most interesting part of these relationships to me are where the animals that are furthest from the line, that deviation means that they have novel physiological innovations that allow them to do things that to like break this investment return relationship that everybody else is living by. And those novel physiological adaptations are what he tied into engineering and flight. anyways, when I heard that, I was like, oh my goodness, I wonder if that's what invasive shrubs are doing. Are they deviating from the line? And so that we're seeing that we would see a bigger, well, I'll just move on. So my two alternative hypotheses are, or the two hypotheses are, that either maybe invasive shrubs are acting like normal invasives and they're sliding up in trait space for faster resource use, but maybe they're deviating from the line and they have some sort of novel physiological adaptation that's allowing them to like photosynthesize better in forest understories for whatever reason. So I measured these traits, the 4 traits of leaf investment and return, leaf nitrogen content, leaf mass area, photosynthetic capacity, and leaf lifespan. And I did that for these 5 invasive species and these 4 native species in 3 sites in central Pennsylvania, and for many species, many individuals of each species, and measuring some of these things. And I think Erin can probably, Erin can attest to this. It's not the easiest thing in the world. But I analyzed that data in the framework of a mixed model nested in NOVA that includes species nested within nativity and the random effect of each of those 3 sites. And for the leaf structure relationship, I found that actually that natives deviated more from the leaf economic spectrum than the invasive shrubs did. So it was the opposite of what I expected. And invasives actually did invest more and get more return on that investment than natives did generally. So what I found, sorry, I went over these figures kind of fast. This is the deviation from the leaf mass area, leaf lifespan relationship. And then this is leaf mass area. This is investment. And then this is return on that investment. And you can see invasives are higher than natives in both. So to put that back in the framework of my hypothesis figure, invasive shrubs acted like what other people have observed globally for invasives. They shifted up in trait space and were able to invest more and get more of a return on their investment. Natives, however, ended up deviating more from the leaf economic spectrum and got a greater return for their given investment. And I realized when I thought about this that it actually made sense, because evolutionarily, adaptation and physiological innovation required the adaptation and physiological innovation that's required to deviate from these conserved relationships likely requires habitat specificity. And so being in an understory for over geologic and evolutionary time, whereas native shrubs in our climate don't exist outside of forest understories very often, but invasive shrubs are successful pretty much anywhere. They just will take off in an understory, they'll take off in the open. So it kind of makes sense that they're behaving more like invasives, even though they still are able to be successful in forest understories. And then for the other relationship, the photosynthesis relationship, there actually was no clear pattern by nativity. But something that I haven't mentioned to this point yet is, and it's important, is that these leaf traits for leaf investment and leaf return, nitrogen content and photosynthetic capacity, leaf lifespan, and leaf mass area are all taken, well, leaf lifespan's taken over the whole season, but they're all taken, the rest of them are all taken at peak growing season. So leaf trait values change for a plant across the season. For example, most plants have higher nitrogen content when they have in their leaves, the percent nitrogen when they're little, and then it gets less as they grow and get bigger. So seasonally or across a growing season, these leaf traits change. And something that we've already established is that invasive shrubs have extended leaf phenology. So that's existing outside of this 2-dimensional space. And so there might be a greater return on their investment outside of the leaf economic spectrum through extended leaf phenology. So the benefit may go beyond this 2-dimensional, really cool global leaf economic spectrum axis that I just talked about. So we wouldn't have known for sure without testing the hypothesis. So it does turn out that, so here's the seasonal, you saw this curve before, the understory tree canopy, the light available in the understory, and you can see it decrease as the overstory tree canopy closes, the amount of light available in the understory. And then I paired that with, in this figure, with the phenological window for invasive shrubs and the phenological window for native shrubs. And you can see that invasive shrubs have leaves about 21 days earlier, and it's when there is a lot of light in the understory, and they keep their leaves 26 days later as well. And that accounts for about, so if you take the area under this curve, basically, like how much light are they actually being exposed to? For like the given light for that, if you're in the understory, how much light are you exposed to? Across how much light is there in the understory for the whole year. Specifically for invasive shrubs, they're exposed to 60% of the available light in the understory throughout the year. And native shrubs, it's more like 43% of the light. So they're getting this huge, invasive shrubs are getting this huge benefit of light exposure when light availability is highest early in the season and a little bit later in the season. But it turns out 75% of this difference is in the spring, because this curve, the ambient light levels in the understory are highest then. And this can potentially be another part of why invasive shrubs are so successful, because when they're active before native shrubs and native herbaceous species, they can have preemptive resource acquisition. So they're active earlier, they can be absorbing nitrogen and nutrients out of the soil and taking up space that isn't going to be available for natives when they start to wake up and become active. And so in terms of benefits and impacts, summing up, there's this really strong benefit for invasive shrubs, mostly in the spring, but also some in the fall. And then there's also these impacts, mostly in the spring, but also throughout the rest of the year, in terms of reduced light and light energy and heat available in the understory. And then to tie everything together and put that into the spatial context from the community science work, this research occurred here in where the yellow arrow is at the latitude in central Pennsylvania. And if we're to move south, these differences, in terms of benefits and impacts that we see, we would expect to be exacerbated further south and to diminish as you move northward, where there's less of a difference between natives and invasives in terms of phenology. So this provides a unified framework for research to move together, to move forward together, and hopefully helps research be able to build more on one another and be applicable across a wider geographic range. And so with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention and thank all these people that helped with this research and my funding. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Hey, thank you very much, Erin. That was an excellent talk. I might be a little bit biased, but I very much enjoyed it. So yeah, I'll open the floor for questions, and Beth will maybe, if there's any on YouTube, can weigh in too. No, okay. So, questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for the great talk. I just have a question about, because I noticed your research focused on natives and then invasives, which are not mutually exclusive. Have you done any work, or are you interested in doing work with certain native invasive species?
Could you hear that?
Nope.
Okay. I'll try to translate here. Yeah, sure. That's great.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you so much for the talk. I noticed, your work focused a lot on natives as opposed to invasive species. But at least to my understanding, they're not always totally distinct. And so I was wondering if you were interested in or have already done work on native invasive species in Understory, and seeing how that has effects on the ecology of the understory.
Yeah, so at Tyson, actually, I was working on a project that was looking at weedy natives and invasives and like non-natives that aren't really very problematic, and then kind of rare natives as like comparables. And yeah, so it's a really interesting question. And most of the ones I chose were, I chose the natives specifically because they tend to be the native shrubs, because they tended to be the more abundant ones. And just by sampling selection, because if a community scientist is going out and looking for something, they're going to find the most abundant one. So that's also helpful for maintaining the sample that I wanted. But it's also why I selected the species that I did, the ones that were most common in forest understories and most commonly found in the habitats that invasive shrubs are. There aren't very many in the habitats where invasive shrubs tend to become super abundant. There aren't a whole lot of the native shrubs in the understory, the ones that we find to get really weedy and be abundant. It's like a different habitat that they're preferring. It seems like there's some soil acidity things going on, I think, and slope and stuff that comes into play.
Awesome. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
James has a question. Yeah.
Hi, Erin.
Hi, James.
Remember me?
Yeah.
So a couple questions.
I bet.
Yeah. She knows me.
So good to see you, by the way.
Yeah. So the first one was, you didn't happen to mention the method of removal of the invasives, and that can be kept very brief. But what's more interesting to me was and you didn't really touch on this, but if you know about differences in characteristics of soil and litter features in heavily invaded woodlands versus the ones that are not. So I'm going to go sit down and listen to you.
Okay. Hopefully I can answer it well enough. So the easy answer for the removals is we cut them. Well, it was before I got there, so that was nice. But they cut them all off and painted glyphosate on the stumps and watched for stump sprouts. And we actually removed, once a year, we removed any new incoming seedlings by pulling them. By clipping them, so we didn't disturb the soil. Sorry. And usually, since they were seedlings that were like first year seedlings coming up, we didn't clipping them was enough. They didn't resprout after that because they were just such young babies. And the ones that did resprout, the stumps that were cut and got glyphosate, the ones that did resprout, we cut again, and we didn't actually need to spray them again. It's just like what resprouted. We'd cut like 1 or 2 more times, and usually they were all like dead after that. And then I was actually for my postdoc, I was quantifying some leaf litter flammability characteristics with the leaf litter under invasive shrubs. And the vast majority of the leaf litter is still the same between invasive and the native dominated habitats, because the tree canopy far exceeds the biomass of the shrubs in the understory. But because their leaf litter is slightly more nitrogenous and way more abundant, they're adding in nutrients that seemed to start breaking down the leaf litter even of the overstory canopy more quickly. And the moisture content is consistently, it's getting late, consistently higher in where there are invasive shrubs as opposed to where there are the native shrubs. So it was really interesting to start to see, and I would have liked to work more on that project, how the decomposition was changing where there were still invasive shrubs with that nitrogen input versus where there were the native shrubs. And it's the overstory canopy litter that was changing in decomposition along with that admixture of the invasive litter.
Good comment. Yeah, and then if you throw in invasive earthworms, it really
Yeah.
is messing with the leaf litter.
Totally. Good to see you, James.
Any other questions? Okay.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm trying to, oh, yay. Hi.
I'm here. It took me, I was all the way in the back, so it took me a while. That was a great talk, Erin. Thank you so much.
My
I
pleasure.
was wondering, I guess, maybe a little along the lines of James's question. I was thinking a lot, from the tick perspective, of course, about the litter and the microhabitat under invasives, and wondering if there are studies linking the extended leaf phenology to characteristics about, soil moisture or humidity in that sort of microclimate underneath, and whether
So
that
most,
would
yeah.
extend the arthropod season. Yeah.
Yeah. So the most of the work that's been done in linking invasive shrubs and ticks together has looked at the moisture content associated with the success of, but not specifically with extended leaf phenology. So it has been found to be shadier, more moist, and more cool by invasive shrubs, but which is probably related to, like, for a longer part of the year, which is probably related to extended leaf phenology, but wasn't directly tied. Like, phenology wasn't actually being quantified in any of those studies because it was really outside of what they were specifically interested in. But obviously, it has to be related.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, now I want to start looking more at phenology of ticks under the invasives. That's really, well, thanks again.
Yeah.
I just have a quick follow-up on Solney's question. You were measuring the light above the shrub layer, correct?
Yes.
So are there studies that have measured light below, or you also did below?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the amount of light that I showed that was in lumens, like, like negative, I think it was like negative 1900 lumens per meter squared, which is like a lot less light in the spring. That was underneath the shrubs. So it was underneath the shrubs since the hobos have to like sit there for a while, they just sat under the native shrubs and under the invasive shrubs in a bunch of different places. And then when I took the photosynthetically active radiation measurements, that's a wand that you like carry out and stand there. And that's where I took the measurements over and in the open. So I got that ambient light levels and how they change through the season.
Okay, cool. Sorry to interrupt you.
James just asked me a question.
Thank you
Hi.
for the talk.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that the extended leaf phenology, it was unique to invasives in part because they had a more reliable dawn of spring where they came from in Europe and Southeast Asia. And I was wondering if, one, how they react to the less variable springs here and the frosts and such, and also how the increasing variability of climate due to climate change is changing how they are able to survive through the spring and into the fall.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think Erin could maybe even tackle it, but I'll, she quantified some of the frost tolerance of invasive shrubs. And there have been a few studies that have shown that invasive shrubs are a little bit more, rebound a little bit better after frost than the native shrubs do. But I think there was like a latitude interaction with those where it's not exactly, so it has been looked at, and it does seem in some cases that some invasives do have a higher frost tolerance. But in my experience, it had in years where there's a late snowfall and the invasives have already put on leaves, they die back, and the natives have actually a pretty big advantage that year. So it might be that, like, yes, they have a huge advantage right now, but as pests and pathogens learn to use them, which is starting to happen, we're starting to see some natives like shifting over to invasive shrubs, which is super cool for their habitat value for birds and stuff too as well. But like, they might be kept in check by things like that, like unseasonably cold springs that kill back their foliage. And then that natives who have learned through evolutionary time to be more cautious might actually have an advantage in some years that hopefully keeps them around.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We want to see Steve.
Okay, come back, Steve.
Everyone wants you to come back, Steve. Can you push that blue button in the corner? I know I'm gonna pull it.
Oh, yeah.
It's all the way left down.
Susan's waving very enthusiastically. There's your audience, yeah. Oh, we probably lost the sound because I picked this up. Oh, yeah. We did try this earlier. We can't hear you right now, so if you can change your plugin.
If they were here in person, everybody would
Yeah.
Shake an ear.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, try and show your headset. Yeah, sorry, we couldn't hear you. But
Yeah. Oh no, that's all right. Yeah. So Steve was training sifters at Shaw Nature Reserve. For those of you that I didn't get to tell our sift turf love story to. And I was working at Tyson, and that's where we met.
yes, indeed. Everyone said we're good. We're good. All right. Thank you so much.
It's really great to be back in Tyson, even virtually, and hopefully at some point in the near future we can come and visit in person.
That would be wonderful. Yeah.
Yay!